In one interview of the would-be Trump 2.0 candidate in the US election, Vivek Ramaswamy, he was challenged on his views on climate change by MSNBC. And he said this:
8 times as many people die of cold temperatures than die of warm ones. The right answer to all temperature-related deaths is more plentiful, abundant access to fossil fuels.
This takes the line most given prominence by climate policy skeptic Bjorn Lomborg. For instance, in this representative tweet: "Cold kills much more than heat. Each year, heat kills 500,000 people, but cold kills 4.5 million people. 9 times more. Yet most reporting focus on heat deaths because it fits the climate narrative." Of course, this is all rather topical, because at the time they were making these statements, we'd seen the second year of major heat waves in a number of places across the world, and studies like the one referred to in this article that estimates that up to 61,000 people may have died from heat-related causes last year, particularly concentrated in the Mediterranean countries which have drier conditions. Now, some of my Patreon supporters asked if I could verify if these claims were true, if there was hidden nuance, or frankly really just what's going on. So in this video I'm going to do just that. As always, without preconception, without fear nor favour as to where it may lead. There are 2 parts to this. One, what are the facts in all their glorious nuanced detail? And secondly, are the various players on both sides then justified in the answers they give to the "so what" questions? We're not looking at this from pure academic curiosity after all. We want to know the truth because presumably that's how we would reduce the most deaths, the most human years lost in the coming decades, which we would like to do. That should be a more important mission than anyone's politics. Well, that's my presumption for this video anyway. As usual, I dare say it won't play out well on, either side, but let's find out. This is my research method for a video like this. We've seen that there are several statements being put forward that seem like they are challenges to the received wisdom. The statements may be true in themselves, they may be false. The suggestion that they are against the received wisdom or against what scientists say, that may be true, that may be false. Where I start is by putting all that to one side and going to the core question. Do more people die from cold than from heat right now? And how is that expected to change, if it is, with the progress of global warming? That should be easy enough, you would think. The first part is the easiest to answer. What happens right now? And the answer is an unqualified yes. Many more people die in the world today attributed to cold weather than die attributed to hot weather. Those figures are therefore absolutely correct. Now, one might intuit, as people seem to be doing, that therefore it is self-evidently a good thing if it gets warmer. Well, I'm willing to bet some people have actually done some research into the detail of that, so let's take a look. A quick search on Google Scholar, the Google search engine focused on published research papers. This doesn't constitute a full literature review by any means, although it's better than some searches I've seen in the past, but it should surface some of the key papers if they exist. And exist they do. Having scanned a number of them, a couple of things jump out. Firstly, questions about how many people will die in the future. Well, surprise, surprise, it's a complicated question. It's dependent on variables that people pushing a cause on either side tend to skip over. How much warming will there be? Well, that rather depends on how much we emit over the coming decades, as well as a few other variables, so we need to look at scenarios. Where exactly are you looking? These equations differ depending on where you are in the world. How vulnerable is the population? What are the actual mechanisms for the fatalities we see? How much adaptation can we realistically expect? And how much difference will that adaptation successfully make? So I must say, I'm always alert to people diving into these sorts of questions to prove a point, because they're incentivized by that motivation to cherry pick the circumstances that support the point that they want to press. So they won't necessarily give us useful analytical information to leave us better informed about the world and the challenges that we may or may not face in it. So this paper gives some useful perspective, reviewing mean temperature and mortality in periods from 1984 to 2015 in numerous locations across the globe, specifically 451 locations in 23 countries across 9 regions. This is important because the relative effects of higher warm temperatures and less extreme cold temperatures plays out differently in different parts of the world. This map shows the different places studied, shows the difference in average temperatures for each. The thing is, if you review the mortality data and seek to identify the optimal temperature ranges for each place, you find that they differ. There's no one optimal range for every place. I mean, it's not that big a surprise. If you live in a hot place, over time, you will acclimatise to it up to a degree. So, for example, in Sydney, Australia, optimal range is between 10 degrees Celsius and 26 degrees. In London, it's more like 2 degrees Celsius to 22 degrees. And the mortality curve on the extremes is sharper. In New York City, which is used to a wider range of extremes, its curve on the cold side is way flatter than that for London. When we talk about cold deaths, what's the actual cause of death? I mean, you might presume it's not actually the number of people discovered dead of hypothermia having gone out for an ill-advised walk in freezing temperatures. According to the study, excess mortality associated with colder temperatures mostly comes from existing cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, which are nudged to their acute stage by the prevailing weather conditions. And that actually applies to both hot and cold. The unwell, frail, elderly tend to be the ones most at risk from dying from either. Not that the risks are identical. With cold weather, a weakening of the defence mechanisms in the airways and a consequent vulnerability to infection is also mooted, which might be why cold kills more than heat. You also have to account in the data for a different time lag effect. Hot days are reflected in mortality statistics pretty quickly, within a couple of days of the event. The effect of cold weather is spread over a longer period of up to 2 to 3 weeks. But also these graphs highlight that the minimum mortality temperature, where the death rate is the lowest, tends to be around 20 degrees C. But the numbers shift from that point on, so you might find a number of cold-related deaths attributed to 15, 16, 17 degrees C. Those are not temperatures that any of us would count as extreme cold weather. You might think this is all sounding a bit uncertain, to the degree that if you look at any argument made on the basis of these sorts of figures, you need to know exactly how deaths were attributed to being caused by cold or by heat. If I'm a weak and frail 80-year-old and I've caught pneumonia and then a hot spell or a cold spell pushes me off that precarious perch my life is balanced upon, fine, bye-bye Mallen. It's not the temperature, though, that gets written down on the death certificate. Indeed, if I would have died 3 months later anyway, but a hot spell just got me a bit early, is that really a death from heat? Or was I at the end of life waiting for the final straw to finally break that camel's back? So that's an important point. Rather than talking in terms of human deaths, we should probably be talking in terms of human life years lost. This chart shows the variations in mortality on different climate change scenarios, drawn from the IPCC. RCP 2.6, which is relatively mild warming, where we might be in the unlikely event the world organises itself to stay below the 2 degrees threshold. RCP 4.5, which is more likely the path we're actually on, broadly speaking. And the extreme scenario, RCP 8.5, which generally I tell people to ignore because we're not on that pathway and it's just headline fodder. I vary that advice just for one group. If you're one of the people like Ramaswamy who says that you want to burn even more fossil fuels, you love fossil fuels, you want no restrictions on them at all, well then you don't get to join the rest of us complaining about the misuse of RCP 8.5 because that's actually the logical endpoint of your policy position. So anyway, while a dozen or so people have gone off to foam at the mouth in the comments section below, let's just review these and note that those of us in Northern Europe, East Asia and Australia might expect to see a relative decline in net mortality. North America, relatively balanced, although how that looks changes depending whether you're looking to the north or the south. And that makes sense. If the minimum mortality temperature tends to be around 20 degrees C, the average temperatures in London are some way below that. So you can have a fair degree of warming that pushes you closer to that optimum before you go past it. Bearing in mind, these are just averages. The warmer we get, the more often there will be heat waves that go well beyond the average. Things look more tricky, let's be clear, if you live in Southern Europe or Southeast Asia, for example, where your temperatures may already trend significantly above that 20 degrees C optimum. In those cases, there's just a bunch of downside. Now, while looking at those graphs, remember how many variables there are. Maybe the heat deaths will be lower because we adapt effectively. I hope we do. It's an easy argument just to make, though. If we were so great at adapting, presumably we would have reduced the number of cold deaths significantly by now, and we haven't. So what we could do, at significant cost in theory, and what we will actually do, your guess is as good as mine. You really shouldn't take a glance only at your own location and conclude that whether there's a problem based on that one alone depends on whether you're going to care about this issue. What they suggest is that generally speaking, rich countries in temperate latitudes will do okay on this measure, a decline in overall temperature-related deaths. They may have other climate-related issues, but that one will work in their favour. The more dramatic increases in heat-related deaths will hit some of the most populated and poorest places in the world. A large amount of human suffering in the absence of the means to adapt, and with more vulnerable natural systems. So that's what the current state of the literature suggests. Now, what about those critical voices? Do they pick up on sources that we've missed? Are those sources better or not than what we've reviewed so far? Obviously, we've established that they are correct on the modern status quo. More people currently die during colder weather than hot. Other than a few Guardian journalists maybe, nobody that I've seen much disagrees with that. The point of contention is how this is likely to play out in the future, and therefore the so what question. Specifically, the claim is that it is clear and self-evident that warming will produce significant benefits from reductions in cold deaths more than offsetting increases in heat deaths. Bjorn Lomborg's claims in this arise from the content of this paper, Climate Change, Thermal Stress and Mortality Changes, published in 1998, rather a long time ago, note. It carries out what it describes as a simple meta-analysis based on projected changes in climate for 20 cities, drawing from scenarios from 3 models, and it came up with the conclusion that for most of the cities, mortality would decrease overall. These assumptions were then built into subsequent models called FUND and envisage. So, for example, Fund projects a net reduction of around 380,000 deaths globally per year at 1 degree Celsius of global warming. More recent studies, like this one, Huber et al. 2017, have looked back at that older work and found two important flaws. One, it combined mortality data for all ages with data specific to the elderly. Obviously, the elderly is the population most at risk, so it's a rather important error. And two, it confounds seasonal effects with direct temperature effects on mortality. Not all the reasons why you get an uptick in deaths in winter are down to temperatures specifically. More people congregating indoors, spreading seasonal viruses, for instance, would be an alternative. There will be more COVID and flu deaths in winter than there were in the summer. Doesn't make them heat deaths or cold deaths. The study, furthermore, found that those models, Fund and Envisage, worsened the bias these errors produced because heat-related cardiovascular deaths were presumed only to affect urban populations, which is kind of weird and has the effect of reducing those, because obviously in the real world that's not the case. So the later study looked at what the figures would be if you corrected for the two flaws and you assumed equal vulnerability for urban and rural populations. They came up with a net increase of cardiovascular deaths, with around 150,000 additional deaths worldwide per year. This diagram shows how that flawed dataset went on to spread its errors into a number of subsequent works, including Bjorn Lomborg's. Now, this doesn't mean that all projections of future deaths simply need to take these into account to be accurate, because, remember, lots of variables. For example, there was one study in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health in 2014. Climate change effects on human health, projections of temperature-related mortality for the UK during the 2020s, 2050s and 2080s. You'll remember that according to those recent estimates, the UK should do relatively well on the scale of things, but according to that paper, quote, more people in the UK will die due to heat and to cold over the next 7 decades based on predicted changes in climate and in population size and structure. The important thing to note is the addition of changes in population size and structure. As statistician David Spiegelhalter observed at the time, actually, the predicted increase in numbers of deaths was due entirely to increasing population sizes and increasing proportions of elderly people, the group most vulnerable to temperature extremes, and it was not due to climate change. Specifically, even in 2080, it was expected that in the UK more people would still die prompted by cold than they would by heat. But due to population change with more older people, more people would die due to temperature extremes overall than they do now. A degree of nuance that, as you might expect, was not reflected in the newspaper headlines following that paper's publication. And that is where Bjorn Lomborg's case is the strongest, of course, the way that newspapers report on this issue, focusing on the downside in overblown terms and ignoring any upside. That is undoubtedly the case, but the poor quality of mainstream journalism is something that both sides validly complain about. Where Lomborg is on weaker ground is in generalised pronouncements about the future based on that flawed modelling, and in playing to audiences who would love to think that this was the only measure that mattered. I mean, food security and the impacts of certain extreme climate events, those are also going to take their toll. Recent events have shown it can be quite a heavy toll. It's harder to quantify, of course, because from one year to the next we don't know which important food production regions will be hit and how hard they will be hit. Right now we can point at a recent history of growing agricultural output and pretend that means that the upward line will necessarily continue on its current trajectory. That is known as the straight line fallacy. Not in itself justification for panic headlines and eco-doomism, but also not exactly permission for complacency based on wishful thinking. In other words, the so what question. If your answer to the so what question is that, well, we can just ignore climate change and carry on, indeed, according to Ramaswamy, dive into that pool of fossil fuels and rub them all over, no, not justified based on the evidence, not in the slightest. If your answer to the so what question is that we have to panic and start shutting down fossil fuels right now, well, there are no studies I'm aware of as to the higher range of deaths that would clearly be caused by that course of action, but it would be off the charts. Nobody is doing those studies because no government anywhere is going to, for 10 seconds, contemplate doing that, for all that some of them, Germany comes to mind, have made some pretty grievous errors in energy policy in recent years. You're left with a range of other so what answers, varying mixes of energy transition at varying speeds, adaptation in the countries we expect to be most negatively affected, and so on. There are some big knotty problems to be solved, for sure. But we're a problem-solving species, so provided we don't get seduced by the call to extremism, I have no doubt we can rise to the challenge. My thanks to my Patreon supporters who were asked to vote on topics they wanted to cover. They came up with this one and then also another one. It was almost neck and neck, so the other one will follow soon. If you want to join that important community and help to make these videos possible, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.